Hello, I'm David Blight, the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. I'm here today with Jessica Pliley, who was once, about 5 years ago, our first full-year modern fellow in modern slavery. And she's here now as co-chair or co-director of our Modern Slavery Working Group. In this segment, we're going to talk with Jessica, though, about her own work, her own scholarship, the histories she's been doing, particularly of the policing of women's sexuality and the history of the phenomenon of the white slavery panic. Welcome back again, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you've written a book called Policing Sexuality, the Mann Act and the Making of the FBI. I want to talk about the book first and then dig back even deeper into the kind of research you have done to, I think, frankly, build a base of understanding. So if there's a problem of sex trafficking in the world, and there's a problem of human trafficking in the world, where does this come from? How did it begin? And what is the role of law enforcement and legality in this entire story? So the Policing Sexuality book, give us the thumbnail sketch of how that came about and what it is about, and then we'll dive in deeper.
Okay. In 1910, the U.S. Congress passed the White Slave Traffic Act, which is commonly known as the Mann Act. Mm-hmm. And what the law does is it makes it illegal to take a woman or a girl over state lines, but also territorial boundaries within the city of Washington, D.C., and colonial boundaries, and so forth and so on, for the purposes of prostitution, debauchery, or any other immoral purpose.
Any other immoral purpose is part of the language, right?
Right. It's this vexing phrase. It's very, very vague, and it actually has a longer history. It can be traced back to the 1875 Page Act, which outlawed essentially female migration to the United States by Chinese women who were presumed to be sex slaves. So it's also repeated in other immigration laws, the 1903 Immigration Act, the 1910 Immigration Act.
So the modern legal history of this goes back to the late 19th century.
Right.
Even the mid-19th century.
Right, exactly, when there was a huge fear of Chinese sex slavery as part of an anti-Chinese kind of nativist movement that resulted in the 1882 Exclusion Act, Chinese Exclusion Act. Right. So yeah, and what I'm looking at is the fear about Chinese sex slavery kind of blossoms into a broader fear about what was called white slavery, which is another way of saying sex slavery, the notion that young women were being deceived or lured or tricked into prostitution, and then once they were prostitutes, they were being held in bondage within brothels. And so this became a huge public fear during the Progressive era. So from essentially from 1907 to 1913, there were hundreds of thousands of articles, newspaper articles, written about it. There were
it's a genuine kind of moral panic.
Absolutely, there were several best-selling movies about it. It was fodder for public entertainment. It was sermons were delivered from church pulpits about it. So it was the first anti-sex trafficking movement or fear of sex trafficking movement.
And the fear. I mean, first of all, why is it called white slavery?
Well,
why did that label?
Yeah, the term white slavery is particularly slippery. On the one hand, it refers to an implicit comparison to black slavery, i.e. chattel slavery. And so there the notion is that the United States had fought a war to get rid of black slavery, and now slavery was being reintroduced to the country, just in a different form, and this time its subjects were white women. So there's a racialized reading of it. And you do see that most of the concern about white slaves ignore the ways that African American, Native American, Latina, or Asian American women might have been entrapped in debt bondage within brothels. So it absolutely has a racialized tone, but it also reflects on the purity politics of evangelical Christians at the time. So white in that cast means pure, like pure, a notion of the purity of being
Purity is a concept
destroyed.
All over this story, right?
Right.
Talk a minute about the brothels, which you write were quasi-legal, even public. What was prostitution in early 20th century America such that this phenomenon came about?
Well, in the United States, prostitution was managed at the city level, at the municipal level
right.
in most places, and oftentimes it was tolerated by the police. It was just kind of managed by the police. So brothels were open, they were public as long as they were within specific neighborhoods.
Sure.
Now some police departments and
Districts.
cities went so far as to actually license them and regulate them. So Storyville in New Orleans
Right.
is one of the most
Right.
famous regulated vice districts.
Right.
Others were...
Even Boston had a red light district.
Yeah, absolutely. The red light districts, were often informally policed.
Right.
So, even here in New Haven and elsewhere, you could find red light districts in most cities. And so they were places, the notion was that you're going to segregate the vice and segregate immorality to a specific neighborhood
Right.
where it could be contained and monitored.
Sure.
And not uncoincidentally, the neighborhoods where it was often segregated to were spaces that were actually also segregated by race.
Sure.
So vice was often pushed into neighborhoods, at least within the North, that were often had a large African American population.
You also write that this whole story of white slavery from the early years of the 20th century right through World War I into the 20s, it's all about youth too. Youth and this idea of innocence that here now we're talking about, or people were talking about young girls who needed to be protected. And so there's this massive outcry that says you've got to protect young girls from all of this vice that's pouring in with immigrants or wherever the perception was that it was coming from. But I found that fascinating about your book, that there's a whole issue of innocence and youth in this story that was never an issue when we were talking about chattel slavery in the United States. So
Well, and I
that
think
all
that's
about?
interesting because, of course, African American children have historically been denied a childhood, and
Yeah.
you could argue that today are often denied, proper childhoods, whereas in white, childhood is fetishized. But I also think that this reflects one of the realities of the white slave hysteria, which is that you could project onto it almost any anxiety that you wanted. And if you think about the 1910s, this is a space, a period of time when there are a huge host of anxieties, huge migration, extraordinary changes in the way that heterosexual romantic relationships are being conducted, i.e. people are dating for the first time outside of the views of their parents. Also there's huge pop cultural changes. There's the movie theater and its darkened spaces, what goes on there? And so all of this provokes a certain amount of nervousness amongst, church-going nice folk at home. And so the white slavery hysteria kind of taps into a lot of those concerns about,
And the novels and the stage plays, and particularly movies that are done about this, fall into a kind of melodrama that audiences loved.
yes.
Right? I
Yeah,
mean,
it was
craved.
exciting, it was titillating.
Yeah.
And it did
Save the girls.
save the girls, but it also does reflect the reality of the commercial sex market.
Yeah.
That this is a time when young women are entering into wage labor in larger and larger numbers, but they are grossly underpaid. And the reality in the 1910s is you could make more money more consistently by selling sex than you could working in a textile factory. And that economic reality is something that worried a lot of, cultural commentators. I mean, Jane Addams writes about this again and again, that we need better working conditions, safer working conditions, and better paid working conditions for female workers as one of the key things to eliminate prostitution.
And implicit and sometimes explicit in your book and in your articles, correct me if I'm wrong, is the argument that some women were making a living at this. They were sex workers. But the larger culture, and soon the legal culture, is going to start policing them and basically denying them their labor or their way of work,
Exactly.
which is still the knotty question at the center of modern.
Well, and I think
forms of
what's
trafficking.
interesting is what happens afterwards. So once the Mann Act passes, then the FBI, what will become the FBI at the time, it's the Bureau of Investigation.
And the Mann Act is in 1910?
1910.
Right, okay.
They are trying to figure out what this law means, and they are trying to enforce it. Initially, they focus on commercial sex, because that's the clearest element, that it's an anti-prostitution law. And by doing so, they start cracking down on sex workers or women who sell sex who cross state lines. But while they are doing that, cities are beginning to close their red light districts as well. And so by 1917, with the dawning of World War I, we have a situation where almost all red light districts across the country are closed. And this has a bit to do with the success of the progressive activists who wanted to get rid of prostitution. It also has something to do with the way that the military policed prostitution once it was clear the United States was going to enter into World War I. But what we see is that when prostitution becomes very illegal within the United States, then the working conditions within the sex marketplace become much, much worse for women. And so this is when we really can track the rise of pimps and the violence that is often associated with the pimp-prostitute relationship. We do not see that level of violence in the earlier period. And I think that that's really relevant for today. Just last week, Congress passed and Trump signed the SESTA law, which essentially is stop the, I'm not going to get this right, Stop the Encouragement of Traffickers Act, right. Something like that. But really what it does is it makes it illegal for sex workers to advertise their services on places like Craigslist.
Backpage.
All of those types of things, right? But sex workers' rights groups point out that this is going to make their working conditions much more dangerous because it forces them onto the street, forces them back into the arms of pimps.
See, this fascinates me as a historian and how you do this work, or how you conceptualize this work, because you're dealing with a world here of early 20th century morality in all of its twisted and conflicting forms. You've got, if you like, evangelical Christianity's point of view on one side. You've got the rights of immigrants on another side. You've got, the social responsibility of legislatures and police on another side. But at stake in this is is it not, an evolving sort of moral order that is up for grabs in this highly urbanized, industrialized, modernized society now that is trying to figure out, what do you do about sex?
Right, and those of us who research this, we are able to some extent, get at the experiences of the women who are being policed through this, attempt to define the moral order a certain way. But the mystery that we are often faced with is we can't figure out who the customers are, where the customers are. We know that there's a lot of customers, but where do they fit into this moral order? They're the big mystery. And I think that they remain to be a mystery today to some extent. I mean, although there is more and more research being done on it. But
so in those massive FBI records
right.
that you studied, and let's be clear on this, one of the great finds, I think, in your book is that the FBI, in effect, built itself. I mean, they did other things, right. but they built themselves in fighting against this issue. And they left enormous records, but mostly about the women, not about the customers.
Well, this is where the story gets very interesting, because for the first several years that the law was enforced, they're focusing on commercial prostitution. But somewhere around 1921, 1922, they shift focus, and most of the cases that they are investigating fall under that heading of any other immoral purpose, which is a vague...
Vice.
Well, no, not even vice. Well, not commercial vice. So all of a sudden, they are investigating runaway daughters. They're investigating runaway wives, even worse. And they're looking at these moments of domestic breakdown, and which is well beyond what the law was probably intended to do.
So men are calling the FBI to find their missing wives,
or mothers are calling to report their husband has run off with the neighbor and headed to the next state over. And so the FBI dutifully goes and finds and tracks people down. Most of these cases do not result in in convictions, but the domestic turmoil that caused it is usually solved in one way or another.
So when you say this is policing sexuality, it's not just that the FBI built or grew because of this, and you have some statistics of how the FBI at its inception, the end of World War I, I don't know, they have a couple dozen agents or something?
Yeah, I mean, when they first start out, they only have 60, in 1910, when the laws passed, they only have 61 agents.
61 agents.
Within several years, they have well over 300.
Yeah, so
and
it
it continues to grow.
because of this issue. The Mann Act leads to the growth of the FBI policing not just prostitution, but sexuality itself.
Right. And you can think of this as a part of a larger vice policing as well, because of course the FBI is active in enforcing the prohibition laws and so forth during the 1920s.
And you even argue that all of this ends up having a certain political significance, because this is the era finally of the success of the women's right to vote. But you do argue that there are all kinds of other political implications. If you police the sexuality of women, or men for that matter, you're also beginning to police other kinds of political phenomenon at the same time, right?
And what I'm most interested in right now is thinking about how this type of broad policing, under the guise of policing trafficking or stopping trafficking, yields stronger immigration controls. And thinking about what's the relationship between managing borders and managing sexuality under the umbrella of trafficking. And my interest is not only in the production of these borders, but also in how they're enforced. I mean, I'm very interested in how policy is implemented. And this is a question that, well, so far I'm in the midst of this research, it's unevenly enforced depending on the border city one looks at. But I do think that overall, when we look at it globally, from the 1880s into the 1930s, we see countries passing laws to restrict the migration of prostitutes. And this is celebrated in the League of Nations and encouraged by the League of Nations studies. It is kind of the construction of what Adam McCune calls like an international regulatory regime on the topic of prostitution and sex trafficking. And what that does is, from the United States perspective, is it helps build up the anti-immigrant legal, machinations that produced the 1924 Quota Act, which is, limits migration to the United States to a small percentage of what it had been prior. But it also helps construct, the Border Patrol in 1924. I mean, they're looking for illegal immigrants, and many of those illegal immigrants are prostitutes or people connected to commercial vice. So
overall here, you've studied the period of the early 20th century into the middle of the 20th century. You've shown how the FBI itself grew in relation to this problem. You've shown that an entire moral order is at stake in that era. You've shown with quite conclusive evidence, I think, that sexuality itself was being policed by the police power of the state. When you take that history now, when you've been such a good historian, and you bring it to now, into this working group, into this conference we're going to do at the GLC next fall, into this current contemporary brawl over what is human trafficking and what to do about it, what does history do for the contemporary current problem?
I think that my research helps show two things. One of which is that when women migrate, especially by themselves, that produces a large number of anxieties for both the places that they're leaving and the places that they're going to. And in the US, this specifically has much to do with the way that citizens are produced by being born in the United States. And so female citizenship and female migrants are intertwined problems that create a whole host of troubling kind of after effects.
The so-called anchor baby
Right,
business.
from the perspective of the state, right. And so, and also women migrate for a whole number of reasons that are often interrelated, which is why the intimate labor kind of frame is very useful, of thinking, why do women migrate do they migrate to sell sex, or do they migrate to sell their domestic labor or their wifely labor, and how are these things intertwined? Then the other issue is that the state builds its own power through policing, and through the development of the carceral state and so forth, and that oftentimes that process can have an extraordinarily negative impact on the people that it's trying to save. That what we find is that the vast majority of white slaves rescued by the FBI end up incarcerated. And then if they are from from a different country, they're deported rather brutally. And so,
what kind of numbers are there? Any numbers about that sort of thing?
There are in terms of like the deportations.
Yeah.
I'm not looking at them, but
okay.
for the first between 1910 to 1935, probably more than 20,000.
Wow.
And so it's not insignificant.
Apprehended because they were prostitutes,
right,
or judged as prostitutes.
Right.
Under this Mann Act regime and just deported.
Right, and also some immigration laws, that they're deported, or pimps are deported. Anybody who's making a profit off of the selling of sex is deportable. So they're not insignificant numbers, and there is oftentimes, there's no real attempt to free or rescue. Once they're part of the system, they are sent away and excluded.
So would you say then, what was at stake in your story you're telling about the white slavery panic and the growth of the FBI in the early 20th century, compared to now, is still this question of when is the goal of solving the problem of sex trafficking or human trafficking the most important issue, or when is the method of fighting it the most important issue?
Right, and I think I attend really closely to the collateral damage.
Right.
And
right.
how is that, how are they being framed? And one of the things that I've noticed, I live in Texas, and regularly on the news there are reports of, 20 trafficking victims saved, but no one ever says what happens to those people.
Yeah.
Where do they go? And getting
they've been rescued.
Right, but in Texas is notorious for not having that many service providers to help, with counseling, housing, all the various things. We know that they're probably not applying for the Trafficking Victims Protection Act visas. So what's happening to them? And this is where the interdisciplinary nature of the working group is really helpful, because working with social scientists and lawyers who work in the field helps answer that question for me.
Who are doing legal intervention
right,
on
right.
behalf of these very people.
But the transparency of Homeland Security is not fabulous, and what we are seeing is that the women who are incarcerated are often subjected to violence by people who work for ICE, and so there's a whole host of related problems that are produced within this kind of frame of collateral damage, and. So that worries me. I'm not sure that building the power of the state and building the carceral state is necessarily the best solution for stopping human trafficking.
But you have shown here that what we're experiencing now in the world, or in the United States for that matter, with this question of trafficking, and particularly trafficking of women, we've been there before.
Right, and
there is a history of this.
Yeah, and not only is there a history of this, but when you start building policy and passing laws, then different bureaucracies or different agencies have their own perspective, and they have their own agenda that will then come into play and will drive implementation. Right. So, they may not be interested in seeing, white slaves. The FBI is interested in getting rid of destitute, depraved prostitutes, even though it's the same individual in both narratives.
Well, again, I think the hope in this is that this kind of scholarship, this kind of work, this kind of activism, if you will, through a working group in a university at least shows us a way forward to deal with this problem rather than just throwing up our hands and wishing it away. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for being here. Thank you for creating this working group. And I just want to say, Jessica Pliley is a professor of American history and American women's history at Texas State University near Austin, Texas. She is the co-chair of the Working Group on Modern Slavery at the Gilder Lehrman Institute at Yale. And in November of 2018, we will conduct a major international conference on the problem of modern slavery, what methods work. Jessica, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Welcome.